Good evening. Before I start, I want to just thank Heike from Durat for inviting me tonight, and for the Architecture Centre for facilitating this evening as well. I just also want to say that it is incredible for me, just a little architect from London, to be surrounded by the work of Alvo Aalto. He offered me a route into architecture. I wasn't a big fan of Le Corbusier's rules. I liked some of his work. And at an early age, I couldn't deal with Mies van der Rohe's precision. But Aalto is a humanist, and I come from the countryside, northeast of London, a place called Epping Forest, which shouldn't really exist. It actually starts in the east end of London, in Walthamstow. And for various reasons, going back 600 years, it still exists and is an incredible place. But from an early age, I understood the value of the natural world and what it gave back to us. And in a way, that ties in really nicely with what I'm going to speak to you about tonight. So initially, I'm going to set the scene, and then I'm going to show you lots of examples of stuff that inspires me. Brace yourself, there's quite a few slides. If we can get it to work. Oh, it's not working. Hang on. I think we have to restart.
Turn off the projector 1 second.
I could tell some jokes or something. Well, we've got a blank screen. I could tell you about one reason in particular I got into environmental architecture, because when I was really young, as I said, I lived in the countryside, a place called Epping Forest. And when I was 8 years old, I was walking in a field with my mother, and I thought I was in the middle of the countryside, in the middle of nowhere. And I'm still going to stick with this, actually. And we got to the top of the field, and I said, "Mum, what's that?" And she said, "That's London." And I was like, oh, gosh. I could see what is called the NatWest Tower in the city of London from this field that we called Rabbit Meadow. It was this idyll. And at that time, I realized just how close and vulnerable we were, or the natural world was. And then over the next 10 years, I watched 2 motorways plow through the countryside that I'd grown to love. And this place called Passenfer Bridge, where my grandfather proposed to my grandmother in about 1920, just after the First World War, is now an interchange between the 2 motorways. So I really was aware of that. And my mother said to me that she thought, and this must be in about 1972, 73, she thought that the only natural world left would be the national parks. So, this is the world we're in today. Totally different to this time last year. Totally different, actually, in the UK, from up till about March 2019. Everybody's declaring a climate emergency, and thank God to Greta for doing it, as far as I'm concerned. Our Parliament has declared, our architectural educators in the UK have declared, so have the profession, and so has the RIBA, and so have our local authorities and NHS trusts. At the moment, 75% of the UK population live in areas that have declared a climate emergency. And guess what? You guys, ahead of us, actually have a 2035 action plan, which is much more realistic than everybody in the UK saying 2030, because we're not going to be carbon neutral in a decade. So why should we care? Well, I care because of these reasons. Mass extinction of species, just a couple there that we lost in the last year or so. I also care because of this, the destruction of the natural environment. And I show a bit of protected rainforest, and I could have shown you a bit of rainforest on fire, or a bit of Australia on fire, whatever, burning koala bears, whatever you want. But this is with the construction industry in mind. This is part of our supply chain. So this is a bit of illegal mining. And why are they mining? Because we need these minerals. This is a bit of a scary map. I nicked it from the fashion designer Vivienne Westwood. And the green stuff, which includes where we are now, is by the end of the century, the habitable land. The rest is uninhabitable, if we don't do anything about it. So why us in the world of design and construction? Well, in the UK, we consume 600 million tonnes of products a year. About a third of that, 200 million tonnes, is cast away, and 120 million tonnes, i.e. 60% of all waste that the UK creates, is created by the construction industry, one way or another. And the construction industry, including the operation and maintenance of the built environment, consumes 60% of all products and accounts for 45% of all carbon emissions. And it's pretty much the same across the world. We also consume all the cement, a quarter of the aluminium, half the steel, and a quarter of the plastic produced in our construction industry. So what next? Perhaps. It's all right, we've got these guys looking after us. I picked this phrase up today, actually. We have witnessed over a decade of environmental procrastination. We've known for 50 years at least, actually, what to do, what the problem is, and we're still in denial, hugely. We're at this sort of stage. Is it worth it? Can we afford it? So, I believe humankind needs to learn how to manage planet Earth's resources. So it's all about managing resources. And it's designers and architects and contractors and makers who actually manage resources. We choose what we make things out of and how they're designed. And actually, if we don't think about an end-of-life strategy for the things we design, we are part of the problem. So the challenge is, well, we're not very good at it. We're not very good at managing resources. So here's a photograph of the last 23 North American bison from 1913. After this photograph was taken, 10 more were shot for trophies. And the last 13 are the ancestors of all the current 5,500 population of North American bison. We just don't know when to stop. Also, China's doing it big time at the moment. There's been a blip in emissions today. One of the reasons is because China is mining lots of coal and burning it. And we are in the UK as well. This is a new planning approval for a new coal mine in the UK. Also, the big fossil fuel giants, they're not denying there's a climate emergency, more like saying that it's not as much of an emergency as people like me and you guys probably think it is. So they're spending money saying it's not actually today's emergency, which they're doing quite a good job. So this is today's headlines from the new BBC News channel. Climate change, greenhouse gas concentrations break records again today. We have to drastically reduce our reliance on raw materials. At the moment, we exist as what a lot of people are beginning to understand as a linear economy, an economy where you take materials, you process them into something, you use them for perhaps moments, and then you throw them away. The problem with that linear system is that we are the only species on planet Earth that create that linear system. Everything else is a circular system where waste from one ecology or environment is food for another. The opportunities. Anyone in the audience read Cradle to Cradle? Know anything about it? One person, well done, 2 people. I'm not the Cradle to Cradle police, so it doesn't matter, don't worry. But it was interesting. It was written in 2002, and it's basically, the subtitle is really interesting, Reinventing the Way We Make Things. How to make things so that they are a material store for the future. So in the future, we're in a world of perpetual reuse. So do good, not less bad was also a phrase. So Michael Braungart, one of the 2 authors of the book, I've heard him talk quite a lot. Met him quite a lot. And he will say, the problem with sustainable design is the sustainable word is much maligned, much misused, but is also a sort of stick to beat you with. You feel guilty about being a human on planet Earth. You feel guilty because you try to reduce the thing you were doing that's harmful to planet Earth by 10% or 20% or 80%, and you didn't meet your targets. So that's where he says, do good, not less bad. So don't burn coal at all. And also, in Cradle to Cradle, waste equals food for either the biosphere or the technosphere. And this is a world where there's no such thing as waste, just stuff in the wrong place. And that's an example there of the work of Rural Studio in Alabama. And that's a chapel that was built for $5,000. So Rural Studio, if you don't know, are a school of architecture and a practice. And the final year project for a graduating student is to find a real client in need, design and make a building for them. And that facade, that glass facade, is 85 Chevrolet car windscreens. And they build some of the nicest looking architecture with rubbish. So that leads me to this idea of this thing called a circular economy, which sounds like an economic model, but it's actually, as well as that, something that sort of performs like the natural world does. But in the human circular economy, we have a biosphere where you've got organic material that's used, reused, but ultimately can be compost, food, for growing more material. But in today's day and age, we have laptops, iPads, mobile phones and cars and stuff, which are never going to be compost for anything. And the big challenge for us as designers in a circular economy is to make new BMW cars old BMW cars a resource for new BMW cars. And I mention BMW because they will say that their cars are 80% recyclable, but not into new BMW cars, only into aggregates for roads and stuff. So in a circular economy, you design things that are a material resource for the future. So some good news. Since 2010, the UK construction industry has actually halved the amount of waste it sends to landfill or incineration. And WRAP, which is a government advisory group on waste and resources, says that nearly 20%, one-fifth of the UK construction industry is already circular. We're already swapping stuff and reusing stuff. And this was also the news today. Big decline in coal power stations around the world, emissions, even though we're peaking today. And that's a little graph with a little red bit at the end, which actually indicates a worldwide steep dip in the use of coal. So if that carries on, we could be in for good news. And this is the bit I read. So I believe it will be competing city-states and regions that give us all hope, not governments preoccupied with 20 other big issues before they can think of the environment, climate change question. With over 50% of the world's population now residing in cities and over 80% of our UK population doing the same, they are now the main driver for economic and system change and have the potential to power a successful circular economy. In 2017, the London Waste and Recycling Board published their circular economy route map for London, which outlined a vision of a capital city thriving through the adoption of principles of the circular economy, an economy which keeps products, components and materials at their highest end value at all time. The report identified that by 2036, a circular economy could provide London with net benefits of up to £7 billion a year, with up to 12,000 new jobs a year, in areas of reuse, remanufacturing, and materials innovation. In 2015, the circular economy package was published by the EU and produced similarly optimistic figures for the whole of the EU. No one heard about it because it was the same week as the Paris Climate Change Accord, so it didn't get any press. Last year, California overtook the UK as the world's fifth biggest economy. Governor Jerry Brown ordered civil servants to put in place legislation to make California carbon neutral by 2045, and thenceafter to be net carbon sink. Amsterdam has pledged to be waste-free by 2035. In August 2018, 19 cities, including Paris and Tokyo, vowed to make all buildings carbon neutral by 2030 and to retrofit all others by 2050. Last year, 620 cities and 122 regions all reported climate actions to the CDP, a watchdog. Quoting from The Economist magazine from last September, more than 800 firms worth almost $17 trillion have joined the We Mean Business coalition to reduce their carbon footprint. And that was all before the declarations. And I've written a book. And this book was written because I was lucky enough, because I teach at the University of Brighton and they gave me a paid sabbatical of 5 months. I'm also in practice as well, so it was like sort of 3 or 4 days a week for about 5 months. And have written this book because it takes you on a sort of route towards closed-loop systems. And you can see there it's steps 1 to 4, starting with recycling, reuse, reduce, and then closed-loop systems. Now, the reason I use the first 2 steps is because in conversation with Michael Braungart, he was quite clear that he thought that recycling and reuse was a waste of time. You're only delaying the inevitable route to our oceans or just covering our planet. But, with the work of Durat and others in mind, I beg to differ. So, step 1 is recycling. And I say it's rather basic, but it's only because I think we understand it all. And, sorry, my slides are slightly out of sync. Okay, doesn't matter. Step 1, recycling. Now, I'm going to use these Adidas training shoes as an example because they're made of ocean plastic waste and illegal fishing nets. And they were produced, again, the same week as the Paris Climate Accord. And the reason they were interesting is because of this ship, the Sea Shepherd, which had been chasing after whalers around the world for 40 years. And they partnered with an organization called Parley for the Oceans, who are based in Manhattan. And this ship was chasing down an illegal trawler, or factory ship actually, with about $3 million worth of illegally caught fish on board. And normally this factory ship could sell its illegal cargo quite easily. But because of Parley tweeting and Facebooking and Instagramming about it in Manhattan, they raised awareness of what was going on, to such an extent that on the 111th day, the captain of the fishing ship scuttled the ship. And the Sea Shepherd, before the ship went down, collected 75 kilometers of illegal gill nets off that ship. And it's those gill nets that make those training shoes. Now, the point being, if you buy a pair of training shoes that are made out of ocean waste plastic or illegal gill nets, will you throw them away? Is the application of recycled material into products a way of raising awareness? At the moment, Ronaldo's football kit is made out of ocean plastic waste. Networks is been going for about 10 years with Interface. And that's carpets. And next year they say that all their source material is going to be old carpets. At the moment, they have special carpets that they make out of these fishing nets. So they partner fishing communities in the Philippines and the Ivory Coast, and they pay the communities money to collect these 40 years' worth of nylon crab nets that are scattered across the beaches and coral reefs. So these people now earn more money doing that as being part of the supply chain than they do from selling fish. So the good news is they can catch fish and eat it for themselves. Some other people have been doing it a bit longer. So just a word for Durat, who of course were formed with an ideal for creating a material out of waste plastic. So it's not new news. And they've also got their Baltic Sea initiative as well. This is a research project that I'm doing, an EU-funded research project at the University of Brighton, where we were asked to source local material streams, waste flows, linear waste flows, and turn them into products for the construction industry. So we've got a lot of building sites in Brighton at the moment, so we looked at construction waste. We've also got fish restaurants. And this one oyster bar throws away 50,000 oyster shells a year. And oyster shells are basically the same, from a chemical point of view, as limestone. And what do you use limestone for? To make cement. So we played around with these waste materials, and we made these tiles. The white ones are 100% oyster shells. The pink ones have got some construction waste in them as well, but they're basically concrete tiles, cement-free, in some cases 100% waste oyster shells. And as they cure, and they continue to cure and get stronger for years, they're a carbon sink. So step 2 is reusing materials. You get this thing and you reuse it. You don't grind it down, you don't melt it, you just reappropriate it. And it's a lot better because you don't create waste, you don't use energy, or so much. And you might call it urban mining, reappropriating the stuff that's around us. And I did this with a project called the Brighton Waste House, where we challenged ourselves to use the construction waste that comes off every site. In the UK at the time, a fifth of everything arriving on a construction site would be thrown away. 20% of materials, surplus materials, demolition, excavation waste, went to landfill or incineration. So we started by saying, well, let's make a house that performs to passive house standards. By the way, it's not a house, it's a teaching facility. Creates 30% more energy than it consumes. But we had kids of this sort of age coming to visit the house every week, and we had 360 students over 18 months building the building. But these kids are holding plastic because we changed the brief for this project from purely construction waste to, this is in about 2013, so let's make it a polemic, a thought provoker. And this is before the awareness of the plastic problem. So these kids are holding the other things that this building ended up containing. We started a campaign in Brighton and Hove, which only has a population of 250,000 people. We asked if we could have their second-hand toothbrushes. And we asked the school children coming to visit the waste house to bring their second-hand toothbrushes. And one set of children arrived a bit late and apologised because they've gone to a local shop to buy new toothbrushes. So that really wasn't what we wanted them to do. But then we got Gatwick Airport contacted us, and they said, we can get you toothbrushes. And they collected 25,000 toothbrushes in only 4 days by cleaning out the airliners that landed, just on one route. We also got VHS videos, DVDs. I think in 2013, the last DVD hire shop went bust. So suddenly you've got billions of DVDs around the world that were useful, now useless. The thing about VHS videos and things like that is this is stuff from the 80s and the 90s. The stuff we thought had been thrown away and gone away. Most plastic ever made is with us still. We just choose not to look at it. We also had other interesting materials held in our direction. 2 tons of waste denim. So we found a company in the UK that imports ready-made jeans from China, and it's the largest short provider for festivals in the UK. So it just cuts the legs off jeans and sells shorts. So it's got tons and tons of denim legs. We had 2 tons of them. It's very good insulation. Vinyl banners that you get when you've got any arts festival or anything going on in a city, banners are hung. They're time sensitive because they've got dates on them. They're not reused, or they weren't then. We used them as what they call a vapor control layer in the construction of our house. We salvaged 400 of them. We used bicycle inner tubes for soundproofing and also for like a draft excluder around the windows and external openings. They've worked very well. 90% of the waste house was material other people threw away. Like I said, it was initially going to prove that construction waste could be reused, reappropriated, and wasn't waste, it was just surplus material. It ended up being a container for dumb designs without an end-of-use strategy, including carpet tiles, which this is our head of building control at Brighton and Hove with a red helmet on, witnessing our site agent doing a fire test on the carpet tiles, which are plastic. We turn them back to front so they're black, so the side that's normally stuck down to the floor is outward. And they've got a really good fire rating, so we clad the whole house in 2,000 carpet tiles, which were removed. This is on campus at the University of Brighton, and it was removed from another part of the building. There was Europe's largest construction fair, used to be called EcoBuild. It's in London. It's now called Future Build. We were asked to do this waste totem made out of waste material, and we painted it with second-hand paint. There are people now that collect second-hand paint and reuse it every year. In the UK, we don't use 50 million litres of paint. So we buy 450 million litres of paint a year, and 50 million litres stay underneath our stairs or in our garages. There are companies now that will collect that. We also hosted the first of our waste zones, which is actually a zero waste zone where people come and talk about circular systems and reusing waste. And then that waste totem became the inside skin of the waste house. And that was us trying to map all the materials, where they came from, etc. So that was a good exercise that then spurned other projects. So we've been asked to also source waste textiles. So we found bedding. Nobody in the UK would use second-hand duvets. Would anybody want to use a second-hand duvet? In Brighton, we've got 2 universities and it's a tourist destination. We have 10 million tourist visits a year. It's cheaper to buy a new duvet than it is to clean a duvet in Brighton. So they're big, bulky problems. We were asked to find a textile material to turn into insulation. We found bedding, which is insulation. We put it into the waste house. We used it like this. There it is. And there it is, you can see. We're testing it in the waste house. Really high-tech monitoring equipment we use at Brighton. And we got on the BBC News for that. Now, that's all right on a campus, on an academic environment, but what about in the real world? Well, this might be a bit dull, but it's actually happening. So this is a large company called CST Steel, and they saved £1 million getting this building deconstructed from in Ireland and reconstructed in Durham in northern England. So they got it, one of the reasons is because it had been BIM modelled. So they had a 3D model of it. They got the original model and drawings. They deconstructed it, brought it over, realised the drawings were inaccurate, so they had to do a bit of welding, a bit of mucking about, a bit of painting, a bit of welding. Up it went. Saved them £1 million. I was saying to Heike that I was in Brussels in the summer, and I met someone from the Netherlands' largest housing association, social housing provider. They have over 36,000 homes that they maintain. And they're doing work with IBM at the moment, and they're proving that if you use second-hand bits from buildings being demolished or deconstructed, you can save nearly 40% cost. So they were talking just about a fire closer on a door. And it's worth taking them off. Some of them being broken, you have to throw away. Some of them needing repair. Some of them just needing oiling. That sort of labour-intensive work is actually helping them save money. This was interesting. Kamodi Groek, who aren't known for this sort of work, they do lots of museums and things in London, very serious architects. They did this pop-up restaurant in King's Cross in the middle of London. And it was an old petrol filling station. And they supplied these new fibrous concrete walls. After 3 years, this came down. Now, what was really interesting is Kamadi Groek had another job in Liverpool, and you can see on the left there the same walls. So I thought they were interesting because they were a design agency thinking we've got one project coming to its end, another project starting, and this is a Maggie's Cancer Respite Centre using the same material. This is really interesting. 20th century brickwork and 21st century brickwork is notorious for not being reusable because the mortar joints are stronger than the bricks. In the UK, anything before 1910 has lime-based mortar, so you've got a brick resource if you want to take the building down. But the Lendiger Group from Denmark took a diamond grinder to it, and there you go. So that's reuse. Now these people might be my favourites. Rota. They're in Brussels. First heard about them in 2010, nearly 10 years ago now. And they curated the Belgian pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and they had this exhibition called Where, which literally was second-hand construction materials pinned up on a wall to look like a minimalist exhibition, but it was all about the evidence and stories and narratives you get with material that's had a life with humans. And now they've morphed into this deconstruction agency. So you read these slides from the top left to the bottom right, and they're deconstructing a bank building in Brussels that was going to be demolished. So they're slowing down demolition and turning it into deconstruction. And some of it is really difficult, dull work. But they make it pay. In some cases, they're the designers of the new interior. They did this for Levi's HQ in Brussels. They gave Levi's their new interior, but it was made out of the old interior. They carefully stripped out the interior fittings, cleaned them up, and put them in a different way. They got their new interior with the old materials. So you're drastically reducing your consumption of resources. We get resources from the natural world. Leave the natural world alone. They're currently deconstructing these buildings. That's the World Trade Center in Brussels. And that was when I went to their materials yard recently. This stuff is already sold. So these are buildings that, if you look back at them, they're not lovely. No one liked them. They're a financial proposition with a lifespan, a business plan of about 25 to 30 years. At the end of the life, the business plan allows for the demolition, smashing up, throwing away these buildings. If you do it this way, you've got a material asset at the end of your business plan, which you didn't have before. And we're doing another project with them, and in the summer, in this coming summer, we're hosting a summer school called the School of Reconstruction. And we are actually doing it with Brighton Hove City Council, who are about to roll out their circular economy route map, and they're actually finding us a couple of sites which are due for demolition. I'm going to see them next week, and they're slowing down those demolition sites into deconstruction sites, and they will be a material resource we'll have about 10 or 12 groups of students plus tutors and technicians, and we'll muck about with that material next year. So step 3 is reduce. Now, reduce is where you turn up at a situation as a designer and maker or whatever, and maybe you don't use any material, or you use a lot less than normal. And that needs you to work really hard as a designer, because you don't do it like you normally do it. You might work with what's already there, whatever that is. And this is where we think of cities as material stores for the future. And this is one of my favourite projects. Lacatin and Vassal are architects based in Paris. And this tower on the left-hand side was due for demolition. And the mayor of Paris had allocated 45 million euros to demolish that tower and build a new one, because it was at the end of its life. It was built in the 50s. In the 70s, it had new concrete cladding applied to it, but it was tired. So Lacatin and Vassal went to the mayor and said, we can give you a new tower for 2/3 the price. 10 years later, the mayor went back, or the mayor at the time, different politics probably, and said, we can do that. And all Lacatin and Vassal did is, I've got a pointer on this, take off the concrete panels. That's one apartment, a panel removed, and then they put on what we call a sort of winter garden. So it's one layer of double glazing, full height sliding doors, a 2-meter extension of new floor area, another layer of double glazed sliding units, and a balcony. The balcony shades the one below. You don't get overheating. You've got this environmental buffer zone, and it's win-win-win. And this stuff was installed with the tenants still in the flats. So crucially, you don't lose the community. You don't disperse that community. There's a book written by Lacatin and Vassal that documents this process. And the community did whinge a lot. They did complain about losing the external walls of their house. But this is it going up. And it ends up looking like luxury flats, but it is actually sheltered housing for older people. And that's before and after. Added value, reduced energy bills of 40%, hugely improved natural ventilation, natural light, ability to change your environment as you want it, and wow, sort of 14 square meters of additional floor area for no extra cost. That's the sort of thing you need to do. Now, sorry, this is Norway, but it's the urban mountain in Oslo, and it's a project I believe still going to happen. What's interesting about it's an existing tower block, and the architects, who are sort of from all over the world actually, Schmidt, Hammer, Lassen architects, have said that they are going to reuse 80% of the material that's stripped off that building on the new extended building. And in addition to that, they're going to use cradle-to-cradle certified circular economy products to do the rest. And by the way, that's, going back to it, that is all about understanding your supply chain, because the old curtain wall system on the outside of that building is going back to the original supplier, who's going to melt down the aluminium and extrude new contemporary window sections. Because actually, if you melt old aluminium, it only uses 5% of the energy compared with raw aluminium. And this is a scheme we're doing at the moment where the grey little towers are only 7 stories high, 3 of them. We're actually being asked to double the amount of housing on site, add lots of new community provision, because there's views of the sea, and half the carbon footprint. So this is about, in Brighton, we've got no space, we've got to infill stuff. But we've got to drastically reduce our carbon emissions because we want to be net carbon zero within a decade. So the new bits of architecture have got to not only improve the environment, they've got to work hard for the site to reduce the carbon footprint. Now this was a scheme in Brighton where up to a couple of years ago they were going to demolish a building and build this new thing, demolish a tower and do this. And I complained quite a lot about it and didn't hear anything until this year when the new scheme gets planning approval and they're extending the existing tower just like L'Aquitaine and Versailles. So that's job done. Now I want to talk about a different thing now, how to facilitate. If you're going to deconstruct buildings, you're going to upload with loads of stuff. And where do you put it and how do you sell it? There are emerging digital platforms out there. And we need this idea of a resource exchange. And we need new techniques as well. And this is something that I've nicked from Superuse, who are based in Rotterdam. And they came up with this idea of resource mapping or materials mapping or materials harvesting, they call it. It's literally using Google Earth, finding the site where you're doing your building and doing radiuses of 5, 10, 15 kilometers and literally finding stuff lying around. Or, for example, looking at the waste material from a factory or whatever and using that as well as existing buildings, trees that are growing, natural resources as well as the waste stuff lying around. And this is us. We're right in the middle of the South Downs National Park, and all the little squares are different sources of material within 5 kilometres of a building we're doing there. And that's the building. From the ground up, it's all waste materials we found. And it doesn't mean it's substandard. This is right near us as well as another project we're working on at the moment. It's Glyndebourne Opera House, which is a rural opera house with one great big wind turbine that you can't quite see perhaps there on the right-hand side that creates more electricity than the whole site uses, which is great. A little blue rectangle we're doing a pavilion. That's the site. It's croquet lawn. And what we're doing with this pavilion is going to build it out of waste that's generated by the opera house, or a little bit of the waste that's drawn. And the idea is that with the VIPs and very rich people that come and see the opera, you spend half the day at this place because it's got lovely gardens, and hopefully they'll start thinking about their own ecological footprint. So we're actually going to use oyster shells again, because they eat a lot of oysters, champagne corks and other stuff like that, which we can collect quite easily to make the pavilion. And there it is. Now, this all might feel like way ahead of where we are or whatever, or familiar, depending on what you're into. But what was really interesting is this white paper was published 3 weeks ago by the Major Infrastructure Resource Group. And this idea of a resource exchange, which is exactly what I was just talking about. This idea that large contractors will start swapping materials. They do it internally, but whether it's separated waste materials or surplus materials, start to swap it. So in London, for example, in the city, the financial district, where you've got one building going up and one building going down, one could fuel the other. And it's been taken very seriously. And what I'm talking about, in my book, I came up with this idea, this phrase, mining the Anthropocene. And if you don't know, you probably do, the Anthropocene is the current geological era that a lot of people say we're in. We've wrapped planet Earth with the detritus of our existence. Ocean plastic, landfill sites, cities, air pollution, atomic air pollution, whatever it is. That's when it first started. The idea is if you rework that stuff, the stuff that's already been produced, you can then nurture the natural world, leave it alone for a bit, close down the mines, become urban miners, mine the Anthropocene, and nurture the natural world. So we're on to the last step now, the circular economy. Little or no waste ever produced. So remember, in a circular economy, you've got these two spheres, the organic one and the techie one. And I want to talk about certain concepts that come with architecture and the circular economy, and one is buildings as material banks. Rota are really good at deconstructing buildings that weren't designed to be material banks for the future. But it's, as architects, you are duty-bound now, I say, we all are, to make our new buildings material banks for future buildings. And I would say I would do that, make your buildings bolted together so they can be unbolted. I'd do that and have a slightly leaky building. I prefer that. I prefer both, to be honest. Not leaky, and there are ways of doing it, obviously. But I was inspired by this building by Peter Zumthor from the year 2000, the Hanover Pavilion, which was vast. And it's a typical pavilion that was only around for 6 months, and often these things get bought, put in storage, never see them again. At the end of this building's life, the springs got removed, and you're left with a pile of timber, because they were not stuck together in any means. They're all in compression. And that was a building store for whoever wanted timber. So that might have built 300 other buildings. It was vast. So this idea of buildings as material banks, and just in case I don't have a slide about it, in addition to that, what works really well with big data and BIM, building information modeling, is this idea of material passports. So a material passport is just one extra bit of information on a BIM model, and it's a bit of information that tells you the provenance of the material and its ability to be reused or recycled. And it means that you understand the value of the building that you own, or perhaps the building where the materials are leased and they go back to the supplier. And that's another big idea from the circular economy, this idea that you lease stuff. It's around corporate responsibility, but you may or may not have heard already that Philips, for example, Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, National Students' Headquarters in London, the clients there, they lease the lux. They don't own the light fittings. Philips do. And you have a contract with Philips, and that means, because of the responsibility Philips then have for their stuff, the light fittings, they come and repair the light fittings, but they're going to give you better light fittings because they don't want to come to Schiphol Airport or wherever you are. They want those light fittings to last a long time. So you get a better design, and at the end of the life, Philips get all this stuff back. So they've designed it to be a material resource for themselves. Otherwise, it's a big pain in the neck. And that's what we need to do. Just a really simple example. I did an 8-story building on the south coast of the UK. This is in 2005. It's second-hand steel, not recycled. This steelwork was taken from other buildings and bolted together. So one day, that can be unbolted again. The steel fabricators that worked on that building site, the sort of guy running them, who was an older guy, he said he hadn't done one of those since 1964, because they always weld now, which means it becomes a monolith and not so easy to deconstruct. And that building is 7 stories of wood fibre board, external wall insulation, second-hand steel, and sheep's wool insulation. So my last sort of collection of slides are growing compostable buildings for a biosphere. And this is a sensible university laboratory building at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And most of it was grown. Most of it has captured carbon. When the architects that got this project, when they got the gig to design it, the first thing they did is phone up local farmers and buy up hectares of wheat and barley and willow for their building. And just about everything you can see in that image, floor finish included, is a natural compostable material. This is even more unusual. This is the hi-fi towers for the Museum of Modern Art in New York by the Living. So that's bricks that were grown, mycelium and silica and cornstalks. And there they are being grown. They take 3 days to grow. There's a lot of mycelium out there now, mycelium products that are used instead of polyurethane and polystyrene for packing. Dell computers use mycelium now. And this is the bricks being tested. This company, Biomason, they do a more brick-like mycelium brick. So this is literally silica, sand, and mycelium. This is the Embassy of Circular and Bio-Based Building that was in Dutch Design Week last month. So I mentioned the sharing economy. I just put that note there so I didn't forget. I just want to talk about this project because I found it quite irritating when I was writing my book studying this project. But this is Venlo City Hall. And Venlo in the Netherlands is apparently a city going nowhere. And in 2008, more people were leaving than arriving. Not many young people left. It had no identity. So it branded itself the world's first cradle-to-cradle certified city. And then found 45,000 euros to build a city hall with its growing walls. And this was the sort of data I found on it. It's going to have solar panels, recycle water, etc., etc., etc. And I'm thinking, great, that's old school sustainable design. You know, what's the big deal? It's meant to be cradle to cradle. And then I grabbed this image off Twitter, which is the in situ cast concrete frame and floor for the town hall. And I thought, well, that's only ever going to be rubble for a future building. If it's demolished, that's not a material store for the future. However, I then interviewed the designer. What they had done is interview all the suppliers. They admitted that that frame wasn't a success. But in addition to that, at the beginning of the project, they had 5 cradle-to-cradle certified products. Now, I won't go too much into the certification thing because it's quite complicated and controversial even. But basically, if you've got a product that's cradle-to-cradle certified, the whole supply chain is where it should be. It's got an end-of-life strategy. It's socially doing the right thing, etc., etc. And they started with 5 products that were cradle-to-cradle certified. And at the end of it, they had 35 products. And basically, for 3 or 4 weeks, they interviewed all the suppliers and options for suppliers with their supply chain for the building. And they converted 30 of those into cradle-to-cradle products. And one of which was the furniture. So they've got 2 million euros worth of furniture in that city hall, and they're leasing it. And at the end of the 10-year lease, the company that gave them, that leased them the furniture, will pay them 300,000 euros for the material back. Because the furniture's been designed to be a material store for future furniture. And that's mentioned because it's a financial issue, which brings me on to procurement. And I won't talk much about procurement, but it's the big deal. The contracts that you write right at the beginning with the designers, with the makers, is the big, big deal, and there's legislation out there. I think this is my last project that I'm going to talk about, and it's the Circle Pavilion in Amsterdam by the bank ABN AMRO. And it's not pretty, but it is a cradle-to-cradle building. It is a building designed around circular principles. So that timber frame is bolted together. The insulation is made from jeans from the employees of the bank. The energy is completely carbon-free. The restaurant there is locally grown food. They reuse water. The whole thing is circular, circular, circular. What was interesting is that the client for the project was Petran van Heel. And he stood in front of my students, because I took students to see there in my practice, and he said, ABN AMRO are a financial bank. We have financial investments in property to the value of 600 billion euros around the world. But we're now also a materials bank, completely using the language of the circular economy. And he's basically saying, if you build this thing, or we do, we invest in it. At the moment, we expect it, at the end of its life, to be thrown away. But if we have buildings at the end of the life are a material asset for us or to sell to others, we're going to make more money. Now, that's not completely perfect because it means they could own everything forever, but that aside, it might be a good thing for the environment. I was at a conference a few months ago, Major Projects Association, and someone from the World Bank had this slide, and I really liked it. It's this idea that you've got social, environmental, and economic things as equal, but they're never equal at the moment. They're the way they're treated, they end up looking like Mickey Mouse. So that's not going to work, is it? That's how it is at the moment. That's how it should be. And so stop treating sustainability as a Mickey Mouse issue. And our biggest challenge is not changing today. And if your design team are telling you that their green design will cost more than the norm, ask them to try harder. And if they can't, get a team that can. Thank you very much.